I, I, id. Sa. Freud borrowed the term das Es, which the Standard Edition translates as the id, from Georg Grodek, one of the first German psychiatrists to support psychoanalysis, although, as Freud also noted, Grodek himself seems to have taken the term from Nietzsche. Grodek argued that what we call the ego behaves essentially passively in life, and we are lived by unknown and uncontrollable forces, and used the term das Es to denote these forces. The term first appears in Freud's work in the early 1920s in the context of the second model of the psyche. In this model, the psyche is divided into three agencies: the id, the ego, and the superego. The id corresponds roughly to what Freud called the unconscious system in his first model of the psyche, but there are also important differences between these two concepts. See Laplanche and Pontalis. Lacan's main contribution to the theory of the id is to stress that the unknown and uncontrollable forces in question are not primitive biological needs or wild instinctual forces of nature, but must be conceived of in linguistic terms. The S with which analysis is concerned is made of the signifier which is already there in the real, the uncomprehended signifier. It is already there, but it is made of the signifier. It is not some kind of primitive and confused property relevant to some kind of pre-established harmony. Lacan conceives of the id as the unconscious origin of speech, the symbolic id beyond the imaginary ego. The French term ça used by Lacan is much closer to Freud's es, both being ordinary terms in everyday use, unlike the Latin id used in the Standard Edition. Thus, whereas Grodek states that the affirmation I live is only conditionally correct, it expresses only a small and superficial part of the fundamental principle. Man is lived by the id. Grodek. Lacan's view could be summed up in similar terms, only replacing the verb to live with the verb to speak. The affirmation I speak is only a superficial part of the fundamental principle, man is spoken by it. Hence the phrase which Lacan frequently uses when discussing the it speaks, le ça parle. The symbolic nature of the id, beyond the imaginary sense of self constituted by the ego, is what leads Lacan to equate it with the term subject. This equation is illustrated by the homophony between the German term es and the letter s, which is Lacan's symbol for the subject. See schema L. One of Freud's most famous statements concerns the id and its relationship with psychoanalytic treatment. Wo es war, soll ich werden, which the Standard Edition renders where it was, their ego shall be, Freud. One common reading of this cryptic statement has been to take it as meaning that the task of psychoanalytic treatment is to enlarge the field of consciousness. It is just such a reading that is crystallized in the original French translation of Freud's statement, Le moi doit déloger le ça. The ego shall dislodge the id. Lacan is completely opposed to such a reading, arguing instead that the word soul is to be understood as an ethical injunction, so that the aim of analysis is for the ego to submit to the autonomy of the symbolic order. Thus Lacan prefers to translate Freud's statement as there where it was, or there where one was. It is my duty that I should come into being. Là où c'était, peut on dire là où c'était, c'est mon devoir que je vienne à être. Translation modified. See also, the end of analysis, according to this view, is thus a kind of existential recognition of the symbolic determinants of one's as being, a recognition of the fact that you are this symbolic chain and no more. Identification. Identification. In Freud's work, the term identification denotes a process whereby one subject adopts as his own one or more attributes of another subject. In his later work, as Freud developed the idea that the ego and the superego are constructed on the basis of a series of identifications, the concept of identification eventually came to denote the operation itself, whereby the human subject is constituted, Laplanche and Pontalis. It is thus a concept of central importance in psychoanalytic theory. However, it is also a concept which raises important theoretical problems. One of the most important of these problems, which Freud himself struggled with, is the difficulty of establishing the precise relationship between identification and object love. The concept of identification occupies an equally important position in Lacan's work. Lacan places a special emphasis on the role of the image defining identification as the transformation that takes place in the subject when he assumes an image. To assume an image is to recognize oneself in the image and to appropriate the image as oneself. From early on in his work, Lacan distinguishes between imaginary identification and symbolic identification. 1. Imaginary identification is the mechanism by which the ego is created in the mirror stage. It belongs absolutely to the imaginary order. When the human infant sees its reflection in the mirror, it identifies with that image. The constitution of the ego by identification with something which is outside and even against the subject is what structures the subject as a rival with himself, and thus involves aggressivity and alienation. The mirror stage constitutes the primary identification and gives birth to the ideal ego. 2. Symbolic identification is the identification with the father in the final stage of the Oedipus complex, which gives rise to the formation of the ego ideal. It is by means of this secondary identification that the subject transcends the aggressivity the aggressivity inherent in primary identification, and this can be said to represent a certain libidinal normalization. Although this identification is called symbolic, it is still a secondary identification, modeled on primary identification, and thus, like all identification, partakes of the imaginary. It is only called symbolic because it represents the completion of the subject's passage into the symbolic order. Lacan's ideas on the nature of symbolic identification undergo complex changes during the course of his work. In 1948, he sees it in terms of the introjection of the imago of the parent of the same sex, whereas by 1958 he has moved on to seeing it in terms of the identification with the real father in the third time of the Oedipus complex. In 1961, Lacan goes on to describe symbolic identification as an identification with the signifier. He finds support for this idea in the catalogue of 3 types of identification, which Freud presents in Chapter 7 of Group Psychology and the Analysis of the Ego. Freud. In the first 2 types of identification, with a love object or with a rival, the subject may often express the identification purely and simply by developing a symptom identical to the symptom suffered by the person with whom he identifies. In such cases, the identification is a partial and extremely limited one and only borrows a single thread, nur einen einzigen Zug, from the person who is its object, Freud. This single thread, in French trait unique, which English translations of Lacan render variously as unbroken line, single stroke, or unitary thread, is taken by Lacan to be a primordial symbolic term which is introjected to produce the ego ideal. Though this trait may originate as a sign, it becomes a signifier when incorporated into a signifying system. In 1964, Lacan links the single trait to the first signifier as one and compares it to the notch that primitive man made on a stick to signify that he had killed one animal. Lacan is firmly opposed to those writers, for example Balint, who claim that identification with the analyst is the end of analysis. On the contrary, Lacan insists not only that the crossing of the plane of identification is possible, but also that this is a necessary condition of true psychoanalysis. Thus, the end of analysis is conceived of by Lacan as the destitution of the subject, the moment when the subject's identifications are placed under question in such a way that these identifications can no longer be maintained in the same way as before. However, while the end of analysis is precisely not a question of identification with the analyst, Lacan argues that it is possible to speak about identification at the end of analysis in a different sense, identification with the symptom, see symptôme. Imaginary. Imaginaire. Lacan's use of the term imaginary as a substantive dates back to 1936. From the beginning, the term has connotations of illusion, fascination, and seduction, and relates specifically to the dual relation between the ego and the specular image. It is important to note, however, that while the imaginary always retains connotations of illusion and lure, it is not simply synonymous with the illusory insofar as the latter term implies something unnecessary and inconsequential. The imaginary is far from inconsequential, it has powerful effects in the real and is not simply something that can be dispensed with or overcome. From 1953 on, the imaginary becomes one of the three orders which constitutes the tripartite scheme at the center of Lacanian thought, being opposed to the symbolic and the real. The basis of the imaginary order continues to be the formation of the ego in the mirror stage, since the ego is formed by identifying with the counterpart or specular image. Identification is an important aspect of the imaginary order. The ego and the counterpart form the prototypical dual relationship and are interchangeable. This relationship, whereby the ego is constituted by identification with the little other, means that the ego and the imaginary order itself are both sides of a radical alienation. Alienation is constitutive of the imaginary order. The dual relationship between the ego and the counterpart is fundamentally narcissistic, and narcissism is another characteristic of the imaginary order. Narcissism is always accompanied by a certain aggressivity. The imaginary is the realm of image and imagination, deception, and lure. The principal illusions of the imaginary are those of wholeness, synthesis, autonomy, duality, and above all similarity. The imaginary is thus the order of surface appearances which are deceptive, observable phenomena which hide underlying structure. The affects are such phenomena. However, the opposition between the imaginary and the symbolic does not mean that the imaginary is lacking in structure. On the contrary, the imaginary is always already structured by the symbolic order. For example, in his discussion of the mirror stage in 1949, Lacan speaks of the relations in imaginary space, which implies symbolic structuring of that space. The expression imaginary matrix also implies an imaginary which is structured by the symbolic, and in 1964 Lacan discusses how the visual field is structured by symbolic laws. The imaginary also involves a linguistic dimension, whereas the signifier is the foundation of the symbolic order. The signified and signification are part of the imaginary order. Thus, language has both symbolic and imaginary aspects. In its imaginary aspect, language is the wall of language which inverts and distorts the discourse of the big other. See schema L. The imaginary exerts a captivating power over the subject, founded in the almost hypnotic effect of the specular image. The imaginary is thus rooted in the subject's relationship to his own body, or rather to the image of his body. This captivating, capturing power is both seductive. The imaginary is manifested above all on the sexual plane in such forms as sexual display and courtship rituals. Lacan. And disabling, it imprisons the subject in a series of static fixations. See captation. The imaginary is the dimension of the human subject which is most closely linked to ethology and animal psychology. All attempts to explain human subjectivity in terms of animal psychology are thus limited to the imaginary. See nature. Although the imaginary represents the closest point of contact between human subjectivity and animal ethology, it is not simply identical. The imaginary order in human beings is structured by the symbolic, and this means that in man the imaginary relation has deviated from the realm of nature. Lacan has a Cartesian mistrust of the imagination as a cognitive tool. He insists, like Descartes, on the supremacy of pure intellection without dependence on images as the only way of arriving at certain knowledge. It is this that lies behind Lacan's use of topological figures which cannot be represented in the imagination to explore the structure of the unconscious. See topology. This mistrust of the imagination and the senses puts Lacan firmly on the side of rationalism rather than empiricism. See science. Lacan accused the major psychoanalytic schools of his day of reducing psychoanalysis to the imaginary order, these psychoanalysts made identification with the analyst into the goal of analysis and reduced analysis to a dual relationship. Lacan sees this as a complete betrayal of psychoanalysis, a deviation which can only ever succeed in increasing the alienation of the subject. Against such imaginary reductionism, Lacan argues that the essence of psychoanalysis consists in its use of the symbolic. This use of the symbolic is the only way to dislodge the disabling fixations of the imaginary. Thus, the only way for the analyst to gain any purchase on the imaginary is by transforming the images into words, just as Freud treats the dream as a rebus. The imaginary is decipherable only if it is rendered into symbols. This use of the symbolic is the only way for the analytic process to cross the plane of identification. Imago. Originally introduced into psychoanalytic theory by Jung in 1911, the Latin term imago had already become standard in psychoanalytic terminology by the time Lacan began training as a psychoanalyst in the 1930s. The term is clearly related to the term image, but it is meant to emphasize the subjective determination of the image. In other words, it includes feelings as well as a visual representation. Images are specifically images of other people. Jung mentions paternal, maternal, and fraternal images. However, they are not the product of purely personal experience, but universal prototypes which may be actualized in anyone's psyche. Imagos act as stereotypes influencing the way the subject relates to other people who are perceived through the lens of these various imagos. The term imago occupies a central role in Lacan's pre-1950s writings, where it is closely related to the term complex. In 1938, Lacan links each of the three family complexes to a specific imago. The weaning complex is linked to the imago of the maternal breast, the intrusion complex to the imago of the counterpart, and the Oedipus complex to the imago of the father. In 1946, Lacan argues that in formulating the concept of the imago, psychoanalysis has provided psychology with a proper object of study and thus set psychology on a truly scientific footing. It is possible to designate in the imago the proper object of psychology exactly to the same extent that Galileo's notion of the inert material point formed the basis of physics. Whereas for Jung and Klein, imagos have equally positive and negative effects, in Lacan's work they are weighted firmly towards the negative, being fundamentally deceptive and disruptive elements. Lacan speaks of the imago of the fragmented body, and even unified imagos such as the specular image are mere illusions of wholeness which introduce an underlying aggressivity. The first effect of the imago which appears in the human being is an effect of subjective alienation. After 1950, the term imago disappears almost entirely from Lacan's theoretical vocabulary. However, the basic ideas developed around the term in Lacan's pre-1950 writings continue to play an important part in his thinking, being articulated around other terms, principally the term image, index, and this. In the typology of science devised by Charles S. Peirce, the North American semiotician, the index is a sign which has an existential relationship to the object it represents. In other words, the index is always spatially or temporally contiguous with the object. Peirce contrasts the index with the symbol, which, like Saussure's concept of the sign, is characterized by the absence of all necessary connections between the sign and its object. For example, smoke is an index of fire, and red blotches are an index of various diseases such as measles. In Lacan's discourse, the term index functions in opposition to the term signifier, and not, as in Peirce's philosophy, in opposition to the term symbol. Lacan thus conceives the index as a natural sign, one in which there is a fixed bi-univocal correspondence between sign and object, unlike the signifier, which has no fixed link with any one signified. This opposition between index and signifier underpins the following distinctions in Lacan's work. The psychoanalytic and medical concepts of the symptom, whereas in medicine the symptom is regarded as an index of the disease. In psychoanalysis, the symptom is not an index but a signifier. Hence, in psychoanalysis, there is no one-to-one fixed link between pathological phenomena and the underlying structure. Codes, animal and language, human. Codes are composed of indices, whereas language is composed of signifiers. This explains why codes lack the most important feature of language, its potential for ambiguity and equivocation. The opposition between signifier and index is complicated by the existence of certain signifiers which also function as indices. These are called shifters. Instinct and stunct. Lacan follows Freud in distinguishing the instincts from the drives and criticizes those who, following Strachey, obscure this distinction by using the same English word instinct to translate both Freud's term instinct and Trieb. Instinct is a purely biological concept, see biology, and belongs to the study of animal ethology. Whereas animals are driven by instincts which are relatively rigid and invariable and imply a direct relation to an object, human sexuality is a matter of drives which are very variable and never attain their object. Although Lacan uses the term instinct frequently in his early work, after 1950 he uses the word less frequently, preferring instead to reconceptualize the concept of instinct in terms of need. From his earliest works, Lacan criticizes those who attempt to understand human behavior purely in terms of instincts, arguing that this is to suppose a harmonious relation between man and the world, which does not in fact exist. The concept of instinct supposes some kind of direct innate knowledge of the object which is of an almost moral character. Against such ideas, Lacan insists that there is something inadequate about human biology, a feature which he indicates in the phrases vital insufficiency, insuffisance vitale, and congenital insufficiency. This inadequacy, evident in the helplessness of the human baby, is compensated for by means of complexes. The fact that human psychology is dominated by complexes, which are determined entirely by cultural and social factors rather than by instincts, means that any explanation of human behavior that does not take social factors into account is useless. International Psychoanalytic Association. The International Psychoanalytical Association, IPA, was founded by Freud in 1910 as an umbrella group for the various psychoanalytic societies that were springing up around the world at that time. The first headquarters were in Zurich and later moved to London, but the association has been dominated by its American members ever since the 1930s. Even most of the Viennese analysts emigrated to the United States. After resigning from the IPA-affiliated Société Psychanalytique de Paris, SPP, in 1953 to join the newly founded Société Française de Psychanalyse, SFP, Lacan was informed by letter that this also meant that he was no longer a member of the IPA. From that moment on until his death, Lacan and the IPA were at loggerheads. During the SFP's subsequent campaign for IPA membership, which Lacan seems to have supported, Lacan was regarded by the IPA as the principal obstacle blocking negotiations. The main bone of contention was Lacan's use of sessions of variable duration, which he continued to practice despite repeated IPA admonitions. Eventually, in 1963, the IPA agreed to grant membership to the SFP on condition that Lacan be stripped of his status as a training analyst. Many of the leading analysts in the SFP agreed, but to many others, including Lacan, this was unacceptable. Lacan resigned from the SFP and, followed by a number of other analysts and trainees, founded his own school in 1964. From this point on, Lacan became much more vocal in his criticism of the IPA, accusing it of being a kind of church and comparing his own fate to Spinoza's excommunication from the synagogue. Lacan criticized both the institutional structure and the dominant theoretical tendencies of the IPA. As regards the institutional structure, he accused its bureaucratic procedures of producing nothing but mediocrities and mocked its stuffy hierarchies. Lacan argued that Freud had organized the IPA in such a way because this was the only way of assuring that his theories, misunderstood by all his first followers, would remain intact for someone else, Lacan, to disenter and resuscitate later on. The IPA, in other words, was like a tomb whose only function was to preserve Freud's doctrine despite the ignorance of the members of the association. The implication being that once Lacan had breathed new life into the doctrine, the IPA no longer had any valid function at all. See Lacan. Even more important than this were Lacan's criticisms of the IPA training program, which he accused of ignoring Freud's emphasis on the need for instruction in literary and cultural studies, and for reducing the training analysis to a mere ritual. The specific organizational structures on which Lacan organized his own school, such as the cartel and the pass, were aimed at ensuring that this school did not repeat these errors of the IPA. On a theoretical level, Lacan leveled various criticisms at all the main theoretical tendencies in the IPA, including Kleinian psychoanalysis and object relations theory, but his most sustained and profound criticisms were reserved for the school of ego psychology, which had achieved a dominant position in the IPA by the 1950s. He accused the IPA of having betrayed Freud's most fundamental insights, renaming it the SAMCDA, Société d'Assistance Mutuelle Centre le Discours Analytique, or Society for Mutual Assistance Against Analytic Discourse, and attributed this betrayal largely to the fact that the IPA was dominated by the USA, see Factor C. Lacan regarded his own teaching as a return to the insights that the IPA had betrayed, see Freud, Return to. Interpretation, interpretation. The role of the analyst in the treatment is twofold. First and foremost, he must listen to the analysand, but he must also intervene by speaking to the analysand. Although the analyst's speech is characterized by many different kinds of speech, act, asking questions, giving instructions, etc., it is the offering of interpretations which plays the most crucial and distinctive role in the treatment. Broadly speaking, the analyst can be said to offer an interpretation when he says something that subverts the analysand's conscious everyday way of looking at something. Freud first began offering interpretations to his patients in order to help them remember an idea that had been repressed from memory. These interpretations were educated guesses about what the patients had omitted from their account of the events which led up to the formation of their symptoms. For example, in one of the earliest interpretations he recorded, Freud told one patient that she had not revealed all her motives for the intense affection she showed towards her employers as children, and went on to say, "I believe that really you are in love with your employer, the director, though perhaps without being aware of it yourself." The purpose of the interpretation was to help the patient become conscious of unconscious thoughts. The model of interpretation was set down by Freud in the interpretation of dreams. Though only concerned explicitly with dreams, Freud's comments on interpretation in this work apply equally to all other formations of the unconscious, parapraxis, jokes, symptoms, etc. In the second chapter of this work, the psychoanalytic method of interpretation is distinguished from the decoding method of interpretation by the use of the method of free association. A psychoanalytic interpretation does not consist in attributing a meaning to a dream by referring to a pre-existing system of equivalences, but by referring to the associations of the dreamer himself. It follows that the same image will mean very different things if dreamt by different people. Even when Freud later came to recognize the existence of symbolism in dreams, in other words, the fact that there are some images which have fixed universal meanings in addition to their unique meaning for the individual dreamer, he always maintained that interpretation should focus primarily on the particular meaning and warned against overestimating the importance of symbols in dream interpretation. Early on in the history of the psychoanalytic movement, interpretation rapidly came to be the most important tool of the analyst. his primary means for achieving therapeutic effects in the patient. Since symptoms were held to be the expression of a repressed idea, the interpretation was seen to cure the symptom by helping the patient become conscious of the idea. However, after the initial period in which the offering of interpretation seemed to achieve remarkable effects, in the decade 1910-1920, analysts began to notice that their interpretations were becoming less effective. In particular, the symptom would persist even after the analyst had offered exhaustive interpretations of it. In order to explain this, analysts turn to the concept of resistance, arguing that it is not sufficient simply to offer an interpretation of the unconscious meaning of the symptom, but that it is also necessary to get rid of the patient's resistance to becoming fully conscious of this meaning. See Strachey. Lacan, however, proposes a different explanation. He argues that the decreasing efficacy of interpretations after 1920 was due to a closure of the unconscious, which the analysts themselves had provoked. Among other things, Lacan blames the increasing tendency of the first generation of analysts to base their interpretations more on symbolism, despite Freud's warnings to the contrary, thereby returning to the pre-psychoanalytic decoding method of interpretation. Not only did this reduce interpretations to set formulas, but the patient soon came to be able to predict exactly what the analyst would say about any particular symptom or association they produced, which, as Lacan wryly comments, is surely the most annoying trick which can be played on a fortune teller. Interpretations thus lacked both relevance and shock value. Other analysts before Lacan had recognized the problems caused by the fact that patients were increasingly knowledgeable of psychoanalytic theory. However, the solution which they proposed for this problem was that too much knowledge on the part of the patient should be replaced by more knowledge on the part of the analyst, Ferenczi and Rank. In other words, they urged the analyst to elaborate even more complex theories in order to stay one step ahead of the patient. Lacan, however, proposes a different solution. What is needed, he argues, is not interpretations of ever-increasing complexity, but a different way of approaching interpretation altogether. Hence, Lacan calls for a renewed technique of interpretation, one that challenges the basic assumptions underlying the classical psychoanalytic model of interpretation. Classical interpretations generally took the form of attributing to a dream, a symptom, a parapraxis, or an association, a meaning not given to it by the patient. For example, the interpretation may be of the form, what you really mean by the symptom is that you desire X. The fundamental assumption was that the interpretation unmasks a hidden meaning, the truth of which could be confirmed by the patient, producing more associations. It is this assumption that Lacan challenges, arguing that analytic interpretations should no longer aim at discovering a hidden meaning, but rather at disrupting meaning. Interpretation is directed not so much at making sense as towards reducing the signifiers to their nonsense, in order thereby to find the determinants of all the subject's conduct. Interpretation thus inverts the relationship between signifier and signified. Instead of the normal production of meaning, signifier produces signified. Interpretation works at the level of small s to generate capital S. Interpretation causes irreducible signifiers to arise, which are nonsensical. Hence it is not a question for Lacan fitting the analysance's discourse into a preconceived interpretive matrix or theory, as in the decoding method, but of disrupting all such theories. Far from offering the analysant a new message, the interpretation should serve merely to enable the analysant to hear the message he is unconsciously addressing to himself. The analysant's speech always has other meanings apart from that which he consciously intends to convey. The analyst plays on the ambiguity of the analysant's speech, bringing out its multiple meanings. Often the most effective way for the interpretation to achieve this is for it to be ambiguous. By interpreting in this way, the analyst sends the analysant's message back to the analysant in its true inverted form. See communication. An interpretation is therefore not offered to gain the analysand's assent, but is simply a tactical device aimed at enabling the analysand to continue speaking when the flow of associations has become blocked. The value of an interpretation does not lie in its correspondence with reality, but simply in its power to produce certain effects. An interpretation may therefore be inexact in the sense of not corresponding to the facts, but nevertheless true, in the sense of having powerful symbolic effect. Lacan argues that in order to interpret in this way, the analyst must take the analysand's speech absolutely literally, à la lettre. That is, the task of the analyst is not to achieve some imaginary intuitive grasp of the analysand's hidden message, but simply to read the analysand's discourse as if it were a text, attending to the formal features of this discourse, the signifiers that repeat themselves. Hence Lacan's frequent warnings of the dangers of understanding. The less you understand, the better you listen. Understanding, comprendre, has negative connotations for Lacan, implying a kind of listening that seeks only to fit the other's speech into a preformed theory. In order to avoid this, the analyst must forget what he knows when listening, and when offering interpretations must do so exactly as if we were completely ignorant of theory. On the complex question of Lacan's approach to interpreting the transference, see transference. Intersubjectivity. Intersubjectivité. When Lacan first begins in 1953 to analyze in detail the function of speech in psychoanalysis, he emphasizes that speech is essentially an intersubjective process. The allocution of the subject entails an allocutor, and therefore the locutor is constituted in it as intersubjectivity. The term intersubjectivity thus possesses, at this point in Lacan's work, a positive value, since it draws attention to the importance of language in psychoanalysis and emphasizes the fact that the unconscious is transindividual. Psychoanalysis is thus to be conceived in intersubjective rather than intrasubjective terms. However, by 1960 the term has come to acquire negative connotations for Lacan. It is now associated not with speech as such, but with the notions of reciprocity and symmetry that characterize the dual relationship, that is, with the imaginary rather than with the symbolic. Psychoanalysis is no longer to be conceived of in terms of intersubjectivity. Indeed, the experience of the transference is precisely what undermines the notion of intersubjectivity. Introjection. Introjection. The term introjection was coined by Sander Ferenczi in 1909 in order to denote the opposite of projection, Ferenczi. Freud took up the term soon afterwards, arguing that the purified pleasure ego is constituted by the introjection of everything that is a source of pleasure. Melanie Klein uses the term a great deal, but restricts the term to the introjection of objects. Lacan criticizes the way psychoanalysts have tended to adopt magical views of introjection, which confuse it with incorporation, thus mixing up the orders of fantasy and structure. Thus Lacan rejects the Lacanian imagery in which introjects are internal objects which pass into the analyst by some kind of fantastic incorporation. Instead, he argues that what is introjected is always a signifier. Introjection is always the introjection of the speech of the other. Introjection thus refers to the process of symbolic identification, the process by which the ego ideal is constituted at the end of the Oedipus complex. Lacan is also opposed to the view that introjection is the opposite of projection. Thus, whereas in the Kleinian account an object can be introjected and then reprojected ad infinitum, Lacan argues that these two processes are located in entirely different registers and so cannot be conceived of as part of a single process. He argues that projection is an imaginary phenomenon which relates to images, whereas introjection is a symbolic process which relates to signifiers. Inversion. Inversion. Freud uses the term inversion to designate homosexuality, the idea being that homosexuality is the inverse of heterosexuality. Lacan uses the term in this sense too in his early works. However, in Lacan's post-war works, the term is used in quite a different sense. Inversion then usually refers to a characteristic of the specular image, What appears on one side of the real body appears on the other side of the image of the body reflected in the mirror. By extension, inversion becomes a quality of all imaginary phenomena, such as transitivism. Thus, in schema L, the imaginary is represented as a barrier blocking the discourse of the big other, causing this discourse to arrive at the subject in an inverted form. Hence Lacan's definition of analytic communication, in which the sender receives his own message in an inverted form. In 1957, both senses of the term are brought together in Lacan's discussion of Leonardo da Vinci, taking up Freud's argument about Leonardo's homosexuality. Lacan goes on to argue that Leonardo's specular identification was highly unusual in that it resulted in an inversion of the positions on schema L of the ego and the little other.